So this week, I want to talk about a game dev issue that has plagued me since the start of Hand Cannon, and that's scope creep. For those who are unaware, scope creep is the uncontrolled and gradual expansion of a project. So, when you first design a game, you start with something called a game design document. This document should contain as many details as possible about your game, such as the main character, their various abilities, the animations that will be required, the environments, list of missions, the enemies, and so on. Basically, it's you trying to get all of your ideas for your game and structure them in a way that allows you to properly organize your project. These thoughts and ideas are usually organized into tasks, and if you're a larger studio, those tasks are then distributed to various departments on your team, and then those departments distribute it to your team members. Or if you're working solo, you just assign them all to yourself and check them off as you go. But either way, it's an efficient way of managing tasks, ensuring that you're always making progress on your game, especially when you're working solo. Scope creep occurs when you start to work on things that are outside of your task list. As an example, let's say you have a single screen platformer with action and puzzle elements. Let's say the goal of the game is to collect the key and exit through a door, which will then bring you on to the next screen. And you need to do this as quickly as possible. In the levels, you have obstacles that can kill you, enemies that can also kill you, and simple puzzles that can slow you down. Oh, and you also have a recoil shot that can propel your character backwards. That's right, I'm talking about my original hand cannon design. So the original scope of the game was going to be 10 levels, each with about 30 screens to solve, and a boss room at the end, which would have been part puzzle, part fight. I had planned 11 different normal enemies, 3 base enemies, and 8 special enemies, unique to the 8 base levels of the game. I took the original demo to a convention, with 1 level worth of content complete, minus the boss room. And sadly, I found most people didn't actually like the game the way that I had hoped. There were some people that did enjoy it, but others wanted to play something similar to the traditional Mega Man game, as the current version felt a bit too choppy. So this is where I went back to the drawing board and settled on a flip screen game. Originally, the game was only meant to flip going right, but then I thought it would be cool for the game to flip in any direction, so I added that feature. However, when adding this functionality, I noticed that Tiled had no way of creating these separate rooms, meaning I had to be aware of where I was placing these tiles, especially between places that transitioned, as I didn't want players to get stuck between walls. I also had to create properties for each screen to set which direction they can scroll. After a certain point, it all just became a little bit too much to handle in Tiled, and that's where I decided the genius idea of creating my own level editor inside of the game, as this would allow me to quickly test my levels as I create them. And I could also make sure to create rules that made it impossible to create levels that broke the rule set. And for some reason, in my head, I thought that this would allow me to finish my game a lot quicker. Boy, was I wrong. I don't know how long I spent on this level editor, but it's currently sitting at around 8,000 lines of code. There were so many rules that I had to add to the level editor to make sure that it performed the way that I needed, but it honestly didn't need to be as robust as it currently is if I didn't make the stupid idea to ship the level editor with the game. When I initially made the announcement, the level editor was what I call complete for me. However, I soon began to notice that the level editor was capable of doing things that would still break the game, other things that made no sense, and worst of all, it was hard to use for anyone except me. This forced me to redesign my level editor. During the process of my redesign, I thought to myself, wow, these levels are huge, as the level editor supports a 31 by 31 screen map, meaning that you can create 961 unique screens. Then this is where I thought to myself, how awesome would it be to be able to make a Metroidvania in this level editor? And honestly, that addition was actually pretty simple. All I needed was to make an item that allowed you to save your game, which is actually enabled by a Metroidvania checkbox when you're creating your levels. However, after I added the ability to create Metroidvania-style levels, I then thought to myself, how cool would it be to actually include a Metroidvania map as the new game plus, allowing players to refight the bosses in the game and explore the world in an entirely new way. As you can see how all this escalated rather quickly, and that's not nearly all of it. The game now features 27 different enemies, which of 23 are truly unique, meaning they contain unique sprites. Some of the other enemies are variants, such as one robot with the shield who stands in place, while the other robot walks about without a shield back and forth. Instead of 10 levels, the main game now features 12 levels, an intro level, 8 main levels that you can play in any order in a Mega Man fashion, followed by one bigger level, a boss rush level, and then the final level. Also, since players can now create their own levels, I had to take in consideration objects that wouldn't normally interact with each other in the base game, actually interacting with each other. This is where I had to create my own physics engine, and spent weeks creating this box simulator, just to make sure that everything functioned properly. I also added 8 mini-bosses, because I played Mega Man 11, and I felt bad that my game wasn't on the same content level as the AAA created Mega Man. I know, stupid. I then took some feedback from people who said the game looked bare, because it had no background art. So I began to add that as well, which meant that I had to add a whole new layer to my level editor. I'm obviously bad at this. So how do you stop scope creep? Well, I don't think it's possible, at least not in a long-term project. However, I do think that you can mitigate it. First and foremost, create a strong and thorough game design document. Second, prototype your game and get people to play the prototype early. Honestly, I think you should actually do a small prototype before completing your game design document just to check the fun factor of your design. Just make sure that you don't get too carried away with this prototype. With the initial feedback from your prototype, create or refine your game design document, limiting your game to just what is fun and removing anything that wasn't fun. And once you start developing, new ideas pop up. But whenever they do, you always need to ask yourself, does this new feature fit into your base game? And if this new feature would require additional work outside of the implementation of the feature. For example, me opening up the level editor forced me to make sure everything in my game worked together, forcing me to create this physics engine. If I didn't have a level editor, none of this would have been necessary. But what if you don't actually want to add a new feature, but instead you just want to add more content to your game? Well, then you need to ask yourself if this content truly needs to be in the game. And if so, how much more work will this content add to your game? And then lastly, where are you with your current content? Once you start to put all that into perspective and think long and hard about it, you'll soon begin to realize that the content that you wanted to add is likely not very important, and if anything, could wait until the sequel. Scope creep isn't always negative. It can result in a great game that might not have been great at all without those additions. However, it can lead to a ton of additional dev time and force you to rewrite large portions of your game. Don't be ashamed of your scope creep. It's a normal part of the creative process, but on the other hand, don't embrace it either, because if you do, you'll never finish your game. Eventually, you have to tell yourself that enough is enough and actually ship your game. Trust me, I know firsthand. That's it for today, everyone. Thanks for watching, and thanks for your time.